Imagine waking up one day and hearing a voice you can't ignore, a voice that seems so real, so true, that you know it's not just your imagination. Now imagine what that voice says. Go to Kenya. Sounds absurd, right? Leaving everything behind, abandoning the comfort of your home in the United States to follow a completely unexpected instruction from God? Who would do that? Well, this story, which might seem crazy at first glance, is about someone who did exactly that. Someone who fully trusted in God and embarked on a journey to a place he had never thought of visiting: Kenya. What he found there not only changed his life, but proved that sometimes God takes us to places we could never imagine, and the reason is far greater than we could ever expect. It all started on a regular Tuesday morning. Mike was a man of faith, but like most of us, he had his doubts and hesitations. He worked in the tech industry in the United States, lived comfortably, and his life was fairly predictable. He didn't expect any major changes. But on that morning, something happened that would change everything. During his usual prayer time, he heard something that seemed impossible to ignore. Go to Kenya. It was so clear and distinct, as if someone was standing right next to him, whispering directly into his ear. He opened his eyes and looked around, expecting to see someone, but he was alone in his room. Mike's heart raced, not out of fear, but out of confusion. Kenya, he murmured. Why would I go to Kenya? Over the next few days, he tried to brush off what had happened, but the message seemed to be everywhere. He turned on the TV, and there was a documentary about the Kenyan savannah. On his way to work, he passed billboards for humanitarian organizations showing children in Kenyan villages. It was as if God was repeating the message, louder and louder: go to Kenya. Mike wasn't the impulsive type. In fact, he liked planning and organization, and of course, this wasn't part of any of his plans. Lord, are you really asking me to do this? How can I leave everything behind to travel to a place I've never even thought of? He asked in his prayers. But the answer always seemed to be the same: trust. After a few weeks of internal resistance, he couldn't ignore it any longer. It was time to act. He remembered a verse that gave him strength. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight. Proverbs 3:5-6. With this verse echoing in his mind, he began to plan the impossible. He sold most of his belongings, put his house up for rent, informed his boss, and with little else to lose, bought a one-way ticket to Nairobi, Kenya's capital. His friends and family thought he had lost his mind. Some tried to talk him out of it. You don't know what you're doing, they said. What if it's dangerous? What if you have nowhere to stay? What if this is just a delusion? But Mike, now more confident than ever, simply replied, God is calling me. I don't know what I'll find there, but I trust him. The day of the trip came faster than expected. On the plane, as he looked out the window, a mix of emotions overwhelmed him. The fear of the unknown was still there, of course. He was human after all. But at the same time, there was an indescribable peace, something he had never experienced before. When the plane landed in Nairobi, he took a deep breath and thought, okay, God, I'm here. Now what? That question echoed in his mind as he walked through the airport, still without a clear plan of where to go. He knew this wasn't just a sightseeing trip. God had called him for a reason, but what was it? Kenya was a place of contrasts, where the natural beauty of the landscapes existed alongside profound social challenges. Mike knew he was there for something bigger, something he couldn't yet fully grasp. And then, in the chaos of the airport, he saw something that would catch his attention and set him on the right path. As Mike wandered through the bustling Nairobi airport, still perplexed by the fact that he was in a place so far from everything he knew, something unexpected happened. In the midst of the hurried crowd of travelers and locals, Mike noticed a woman holding a sign with the name Michael. At first, he thought it was just a coincidence. After all, Michael is a common name. But something in his heart nudged him to approach. Maybe it's for someone else, he thought, hesitating. However, unsure of what else to do, he walked toward her. As he got closer, the woman, who appeared to be in her 40s, locked eyes with him and smiled as if she had been waiting for him all along. Michael? Are you Michael? She asked with a slight accent. Mike was stunned. Yes, I'm Michael. But how do you know who I am? She laughed. with a calmness that contrasted with Mike's internal confusion. "My name is Esther. I run a humanitarian mission in the villages north of Nairobi. I was instructed a few weeks ago to be here today and wait for you. God told me a man named Michael would come, and now here you are." Mike was speechless. How could she have known? Could it be that God had been orchestrating everything from the start? Still trying to process what had just happened, he accepted Esther's offer to take him to the place where she worked. The journey through the dirt roads, surrounded by the vastness of the Kenyan countryside, felt surreal. During the hours they spent together in the car, Esther explained that her mission involved helping local communities overcome problems such as the lack of clean water and extreme poverty. They offered medical support, education, and basic resources to the most remote villages. She told Mike about her own journey, about how she had moved to Kenya years ago, and how, after a similar calling from God, she had founded the mission. "God has mysterious ways of guiding us, doesn't he?" she said with a smile. Mike, still processing everything, could only nod in agreement. When they arrived at the small village where Esther lived, Mike was struck by the simplicity, but also by the resilient spirit of the people. Children ran around, laughing and playing, while adults worked hard under the scorching sun. He felt out of place, like a foreigner in a world so different from his own. Yet at the same time, something inside him began to change. There was a growing peace in his heart, a certainty that he was in the right place at the right time. Esther introduced Mike to her team and to the people in the community. They welcomed him warmly, as if he had been part of the family all along. In the days that followed, he started helping out wherever he could. At first, it was small tasks, distributing food, helping to build a new school, and most importantly, listening to the life stories of the people. Each story was a testament to perseverance, and slowly, Mike began to understand why God had brought him there. He wasn't just there to help in the traditional sense. He was there to learn, to understand the true nature of faith and trusting in God. One day, while walking through the village, Mike saw something that would leave a lasting impression on him. An elderly woman who could barely walk due to age and a life of hard work approached him with a shy smile. She handed him a small gift, a shell she had found near the river. It was a simple gesture, but full of meaning. "This shell reminds me that God always provides for us, even in the smallest things," she said, her voice shaky but full of conviction. Mike held the shell in his hands, and in that moment, felt the depth of what he was experiencing. He was in a place where people, despite having so little, trusted God in a way he had never experienced before. That small shell, given to Mike by the elderly woman, stayed with him as a symbol of the unshakable trust he witnessed among the people in Kenya. Every day he spent there was a living lesson in faith and resilience. While Mike had started this journey, believing that God had sent him to help others, he quickly realized that, in fact, he was learning far more than he could ever give. The people of that small village had much less in material wealth than he was used to, but the spiritual richness they possessed was something rare. There was something different about how they understood life, how they faced adversity, and above all, how they trusted God to meet their needs. One morning, while helping to dig a well, a crisis arose. Esther's team had been trying to drill into the ground for weeks, searching for water, but all efforts seemed futile. The drought was harsh, and water was becoming scarcer by the day. The community depended on that well to survive. Mike could feel the weight of worry in the air. The children watched the adults in silence, as if waiting for a miracle. "We can't give up," Esther said, her eyes fixed on the hole they had dug. "God has brought us this far. He won't abandon us now." But the days dragged on with no success. Mike, seeing the despair on people's faces, began to question. "Did I hear God's call correctly?" he thought one particularly difficult night. Even with all his trust, he found himself struggling with doubt. He had sold his belongings, left everything behind, and traveled halfway across the world. What if it had all been for nothing? During a solitary prayer that night, he asked for a sign. "God, I trusted you, but I need direction. Show me what to do." The next morning, as the sun rose, something incredible happened. An elderly woman from the village, known for her unwavering faith, walked slowly to the site where they were digging the well. With measured steps, she approached and, without saying a word, knelt on the ground. Everyone stopped to watch in silence. She began to pray. Her prayer wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was filled with a serenity that seemed to spread across the entire area. When she finished, she opened her eyes and looked directly at Mike. "The water will come. God has already heard us." That moment deeply moved Mike. He felt something shift inside him, as if an invisible energy was flowing between everyone there. And astonishingly, the next day, after drilling a little deeper, they hit an underground water source. The joy that erupted in the community was indescribable. People hugged each other, crying and praising God. For Mike, that moment was a confirmation that he was exactly where he needed to be. More than that, it was a reminder that, no matter how impossible the circumstances seemed, true faith always bore fruit. He had asked for a sign, and God had responded in a clear and powerful way. From that day on, Mike's relationship with the community and his own faith transformed. He became more involved in local projects, helping to develop irrigation systems and build shelters for families. Every small victory was a win, not just for the village, but also for his spiritual journey. He realized that trusting God often meant continuing to believe, even when you don't fully understand his plans. And in that little village in Kenya, Mike experienced that trust in a way he never could have imagined. Still, something inside him told him that his mission in Kenya was far from over. He had found water, he had found purpose, but part of his soul was still searching for something deeper. Perhaps it was the discovery of his true calling, or maybe it was another lesson God still wanted him to learn. What he knew for sure was that Kenya had become more than just a destination on the map. It was now a place where his faith and life were deeply rooted. But what would be the next step in this surprising journey? He didn't know yet. However, he was ready for whatever came next. After the miracle of the water, word spread quickly among neighboring villages. The small community where Mike was living became seen as a symbol of faith and perseverance. People from far-off areas began traveling there, hoping to receive the same kind of blessing. The village, once small and unknown, began attracting volunteers, missionaries, and even international organizations eager to help transform the lives of the people. However, for Mike, that wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Amidst this sudden growth, a new responsibility started weighing on his shoulders. He felt there was something more he needed to do, but he couldn't quite figure out what. God's presence was constant in his life now, and Mike knew that the Lord was still speaking to him, even if it was in whispers. One night, during prayer, he felt that unmistakable voice again. This time, the message was even more challenging. Connect the villages. Mike was confused at first. Connect? What did that mean? Was he supposed to unite the local communities in some way? Or was it something even bigger? The next day, he shared the feeling with Esther. She listened attentively, as she always did, and then calmly replied, "Perhaps God is asking you to go further. There are many isolated villages out here, communities that suffer the same hardships we once did. Maybe you're the link that will unite them, the catalyst to bring more hope and help." Her words resonated deeply with Mike. There were so many other people, entire families struggling to survive in the more remote areas of Kenya. He knew he couldn't ignore this new call, but how could he connect these villages without the resources or infrastructure they needed? Then, something remarkable happened. During a visit to Nairobi to gather supplies, Mike met a group of engineers working on satellite internet technology for remote areas in Africa. They were looking for locations to test their new system, and after hearing about Mike's mission in the villages, they were eager to collaborate. The idea seemed absurd at first, bringing internet to regions that barely had access to clean water. But Mike knew that connecting these villages to the outside world could transform their reality. They could communicate with aid organizations, seek help, and above all, learn about new solutions to the problems they faced. With the help of Esther and her team, Mike began coordinating the installation of internet access points in the villages. At first, people were skeptical. What good is the internet if we barely have enough food, some asked. But Mike had a bigger vision. He knew that technology could bring more than just entertainment or distraction. It could connect community leaders with agricultural experts, doctors who could provide remote guidance, and even churches from around the world who wanted to help. The first internet connection point was set up in the village where Mike was living. When the system went live, a group of children and adults gathered around a single computer screen, amazed by what they saw. For the first time, the children were able to watch educational videos about health and hygiene, while the adults learned new irrigation techniques they could apply to their farms. But the most profound impact came from a local pastor who, with tears in his eyes, accessed a digital Bible for the first time in his life. For him, that moment was nothing short of a miracle. Mike saw the potential this had. God had called him not only to bring physical water, but also to bring knowledge and tools that would help these communities thrive in ways he had never imagined. The villages began connecting with one another, sharing experiences and solutions to common problems. The project gained momentum, and within a few months, other communities began requesting internet access points, turning this simple initiative into something much bigger. However, despite all the progress, Mike knew his journey wasn't over. The project to connect the villages had become a success, but he still felt that God had more to show him. The lessons of trust he had learned thus far were deep, but he knew that faith wasn't just about accomplishing great things. There was something more waiting for him, a final lesson that might not involve technology, but something even more intimate and spiritual. He kept asking God, "What else do you want from me here? What is the next step?" As Mike continued to expand the project, connecting the villages, a growing sense of restlessness began to fill his heart. He was proud of the positive impact his journey had made, but he felt that something was still missing. Perhaps it was the accumulated exhaustion after months of intense work, or the realization that while he was transforming lives, his own spiritual journey was still searching for deeper meaning. Even with all the progress, Mike started to feel that his mission in Kenya wasn't quite complete. One night, while reflecting deeply on this restlessness, Mike found himself staring up at the Kenyan night sky. It was unlike any other sky he had seen. The vastness of the stars shining brightly in a clear, quiet sky made him feel more connected to God than ever before. "Lord, show me what I'm still missing. What is the next step?" he prayed softly. The answer didn't come immediately, but as before, he knew that God spoke in his own perfect time. The next day, Mike was called to visit an even more distant village, where rumors of an urgent need had reached them. Upon arriving, he found a community devastated by hunger and a severe water shortage. The crops had failed, and the children, visibly malnourished, moved slowly and quietly through the dry fields. Mike had seen many difficult situations since arriving in Kenya, but this one touched him in a different way. The hunger here was overwhelming, almost oppressive. He realized that internet access or new farming techniques might not be enough to solve the immediate and desperate needs of these people. As he walked through the village, he came across an elderly woman sitting outside a small hut. She beckoned him over with a gentle wave, and Mike, feeling a strong spiritual pull, approached her. When he reached her, the woman, in a frail but wise voice, said, "There is something you haven't found yet, something God wants you to see." Intrigued, Mike sat beside her, and she began to tell a story. She spoke of a sacred cave hidden in the mountains to the north, where the elders of the community used to go and pray in times of crisis. According to local tradition, that place was where God revealed his most profound instructions, but very few people dared to venture there. Something in her story sparked an intense curiosity in Mike. "Does God have something to show me there?" he asked. The woman slowly nodded. Despite her cryptic words, Mike felt that this was the answer he had been seeking. Without hesitation, he decided that he needed to make the journey. The following morning, with Esther's blessing and the support of the community, Mike set off toward the mountains. The trip would be long and challenging, but he was determined to discover what God still wanted to reveal to him. As he climbed the rocky path, alone and in silence, his prayers became more intense. "I'm in your hands, Lord. I've come this far because I trust you." The journey was arduous, the sun scorching, but Mike continued forward, knowing he was approaching something sacred. After hours of walking, he finally reached the entrance of the cave. It was a narrow crevice in the rocks, hidden among the mountains. The environment around him was completely silent, as if the world itself had stopped. Mike entered the cave with his heart racing, feeling a mixture of reverence and anticipation. Inside, the sunlight barely penetrated, and all he could hear was the soft sound of his own breathing. As he knelt on the cold floor of the cave, Mike began to pray once more. "Lord, I'm here. Speak to me. What is it that I still need to understand?" For several minutes, he remained in silence, hearing nothing but the echo of his thoughts. But then, in a moment of pure serenity, a deep sense of peace enveloped him. He didn't hear an audible voice like before, but he felt a message clearly in his heart. "You have already found what you were looking for. What was missing wasn't an action, but total surrender. Trust me completely, without reservation." Mike realized in that instant that the final lesson wasn't about accomplishing something great or discovering a new project. It was about fully surrendering to God's will, trusting completely without needing to understand every detail. His journey to Kenya wasn't just about helping others. It was about transforming his own heart, about understanding that trusting God meant walking in faith, even when the path wasn't clear. As he left the cave, Mike felt an inner renewal. His mission in Kenya wasn't over, but he now knew that the next steps would not be driven by a sense of urgency to achieve results, but by a deep spiritual surrender. He returned to the village with a new clarity, ready to continue his journey of faith and service, knowing that God would guide every step, just as he always had. Mike descended from the mountains with a heart lighter than it had been in months. The silence of the cave still echoed within him, not as emptiness, but as the peace that comes from a complete surrender to God. He now understood that his mission in Kenya was not just to change the lives of others, but to transform his own heart in the process. God had guided him to this remote place, not only to help a community in need, but to teach him the depth of trusting in his plan, a trust that went beyond actions or results. With this newfound clarity, Mike returned to the village where Esther and the others waited, eager to hear about what he had discovered. When he arrived, he found the village facing an unexpected crisis. The harvest season was in jeopardy due to a sudden outbreak of a crop-eating pest. Anxiety hung in the air as families feared they might lose everything they had worked for. Though Mike was still processing his own spiritual journey, he knew that this new challenge was part of what God wanted him to face. But this time, he didn't feel the weight of fear or doubt. The message he had received in the cave, to trust fully and unconditionally, was now deeply ingrained in his heart. Mike gathered with Esther and the village leaders. Everyone was worried, but Mike remained calm and focused. He asked everyone to come together in prayer. Even in the face of such an urgent threat, he knew that a solution would come. Perhaps not in the way they expected, but it would come. As they prayed together, Mike felt a growing sense of confidence. "We can't control everything, but we can trust in the Lord who is in control," he told the community. "The pests might seem like a threat right now, but I believe God will show us a way through this. We need to keep trusting and acting in faith." After the prayer, Mike and Esther's team began researching natural alternatives to combat the pests. They reached out to the network of experts they had established through the new internet connections, seeking advice on how to handle the crisis. Within days, they found a simple but effective solution that allowed them to stop the infestation and save a portion of the crops. Although the harvest was not as abundant as they had hoped, it was far better than they had feared. Once again, faith and trust had triumphed over fear. For Mike, this event was a reflection of the deeper lesson he had learned. Trusting God was not about expecting everything to go perfectly, but about standing firm even when storms arose. Each new challenge reminded him that he didn't need to understand everything. He just needed to trust. The weeks that followed were filled with a sense of community and spiritual growth. The connection between the villages, made possible through the Internet project, brought more help than anyone had anticipated. Missionaries from different parts of the world started arriving, offering knowledge, resources, and hope. But beyond all the external aid, what impacted Mike the most was the spiritual growth he witnessed in the people around him. The simple and powerful faith he had seen in the beginning was now something that had become a part of his own life, permanently. Even after months of hard work, Mike still felt that his time in Kenya was far from over. He could return to the United States, but the mission that God had placed in his heart continued to grow. The villages were connected, both digitally and spiritually, but there was still much more to be done. With Esther and other local leaders, Mike began planning the creation of a learning center, a place where the communities could come together not only to learn about sustainable agriculture and basic survival skills, but to grow spiritually, sharing testimonies and teachings with one another. The center would be a place of both education and prayer, where people from all over Kenya could find support in times of material and spiritual need. Mike knew this wouldn't be built overnight, but he also knew, with unshakable confidence, that God was in control of every detail. His days in Kenya became a routine of hard work, prayer, and learning, and he finally understood that his faith journey would never be about reaching a final goal, but about continuing to trust in God, one step at a time. Mike became a respected figure among the villages. His story of trusting God and following what seemed like a crazy calling inspired many around him to live with more faith and courage. He was no longer just the foreigner who had arrived by divine instruction. He was now part of the community, someone who had been transformed just as much as those he had come to help. And with each new challenge, he remembered the words that echoed in his heart from the cave: "Trust me completely, without reservation." That was the true purpose of his journey, a lesson in faith that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As Mike looked back on everything that had happened since he first heard that seemingly absurd instruction, "Go to Kenya," he realized that God had indeed guided every step of his journey. What started as a confusing, unsettling calling had transformed into one of the most profound spiritual adventures of his life. Kenya had not only revealed new lands to him, but opened his heart to an unshakable trust in God's plan. He learned that trusting God was more than just following commands. It was about total surrender, without needing to see the full picture, and knowing that God was working even when the outcome wasn't clear. The impact Mike had on the Kenyan communities was undeniable. They had found water, connected with the outside world, and now had the resources and hope they once lacked. But more importantly, it was their faith that had been transformed. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about thriving in the face of adversity, knowing that even in drought, despair, or pestilence, God's presence was ever near. And that lesson of faith, more than any technological innovation or physical help, was what Mike saw blossoming among the people. The learning center that he had begun planning with Esther and the local leaders was set to become a reality. The community, united by faith and shared purpose, was working together to create something that would benefit not only their generation, but future generations as well. Mike knew this would be the most lasting legacy of his mission, not what he did for them, but what they had built together, with God guiding every step. Now, as Mike reflected on his own life, he understood that the spiritual journey never truly ends. Even if he returned to the United States, the trust he had learned in Kenya would remain with him forever. Every decision, every step forward would be shaped by the same unshakable trust that had led him on this journey in the first place. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. The words of Proverbs 3 verse 5-6 would continue to be his guide wherever in the world he found himself. Filled with gratitude, Mike prepared for the next chapter of his life, knowing that when God calls, no matter how crazy it may seem, the only response is to trust and follow. God's plans never fail, and it's often in the most unexpected places and situations that he reveals the greatest miracles. Now that you've followed this incredible journey of faith and trusting in God, it's time to reflect. What has God been asking you to do? Maybe he's calling you to something that seems crazy, but remember, trusting him means taking one step at a time, even when you can't see the whole path. If this story has touched your heart and inspired you in any way, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to our channel to receive more stories that will strengthen your faith and encourage you to follow the purpose God has for your life. Hit the like button so YouTube can recommend this video to more people who need to hear this message, and share it with friends or family members who could benefit from this inspiration. Also, don't miss out on watching our other suggested videos. Each one brings powerful lessons that will help you walk with more faith and trust in God. Now it's your turn to answer His call.